Her card was declined, and her twins were already crying from hunger. But what happened next would leave everyone in that store completely silent. No one expected a billionaire to step forward, but the real shock wasn't the card he used. It was the reason why. The register beeped sharply, the kind of sound that turns heads in a crowded checkout line. And Hannah Miller felt every pair of eyes land on her at once as she adjusted the baby carrier on her chest and gently rocked the second infant in the cart. Her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Can you try it again?" The cashier hesitated, then swiped the card one more time, slower this time, as if that might change the outcome. But the screen flashed the same cold message, declined. Hannah swallowed hard, forcing a small, embarrassed smile that didn't reach her eyes, already glassy with exhaustion, and she quickly glanced down at the total. $47.82 for 2 cans of formula, the only thing standing between her babies and another night of crying. Behind her, someone sighed impatiently. Another person shifted their weight, their cart rattling softly. The pressure built fast, thick and suffocating, like the air itself was judging her. "I'm sorry," Hannah murmured, her cheeks burning as she reached for the formula cans, her hands trembling just enough to make it obvious she was holding herself together by a thread. "I'll just put these back." One of the babies let out a small, sharp cry, the kind that cut straight through a mother's composure, and Hannah froze for a second, her eyes closing as if she could block out the sound. But she couldn't block out the truth either. She had $12.14 left in her account. Rent was already 3 days overdue, and her next paycheck wasn't coming for another week. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was the moment everything started to fall apart. A man near the back of the line watched quietly, his expression unreadable, dressed simply in a dark coat that didn't hint at anything extraordinary. Yet there was something about the way he observed, calm, focused, almost intentional, that didn't match the rest of the crowd's discomfort. As Hannah carefully placed one can back on the counter, trying to decide which baby she could feed first if she had to choose, the man stepped forward, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the tension. "No, you won't." The room seemed to pause. Even the cashier looked up. Hannah blinked, confused, as the man reached into his wallet and placed a sleek black card on the counter with a quiet, deliberate motion that somehow carried more weight than any loud gesture ever could. "Add it to mine," he said simply. Hannah shook her head immediately, instinctively, her pride flaring even through the exhaustion. "I can't accept that." The man met her eyes then, steady and unshaken, and for the first time there was something deeper behind his calm, something personal. "You're not accepting charity," he replied, his voice softer now, but even more certain. "You're accepting a moment that I once needed and no one gave me." Hannah hesitated, caught between disbelief and desperation, while the babies shifted restlessly, and for a second that felt longer than it should, the entire store seemed to wait on her decision, unaware that this small exchange was about to change far more than just a single grocery bill. Hannah's fingers tightened around the edge of the card as she stared at the black card resting on the counter, her instinct still telling her to refuse, to step back, to somehow hold on to the last fragile piece of dignity she had left. But the soft whimper from one of her twins broke through that instinct like a quiet alarm she could not ignore, and she looked down at their tiny faces, their needs so simple and so urgent that pride suddenly felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. And slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded, her voice barely steady as she said, "Thank you." While the cashier quickly processed the payment, the tension in the line dissolving into murmurs of surprise, and the receipt printed with a sharp sound that seemed to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. And as Hannah reached for the bag, unsure of what to say next, the man did not move away like she expected. Instead, he stayed there, calm and composed, as if this moment was not unusual for him. Yet there was nothing careless about his presence, no hint of showing off or impatience, only a quiet attention that made Hannah feel both seen and unsettled at the same time. "What are their names?" he asked, nodding gently toward the babies, and Hannah hesitated for a second before answering. "Lily and Noah," her voice softening as she adjusted the blanket around them. And for the first time since the card was declined, there was a flicker of warmth in her expression, the kind that only appeared when she spoke about them. "They are beautiful," he said, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, only sincerity, which made it harder for Hannah to dismiss the moment as just another act of random kindness, because it did not feel random at all. It felt intentional, and that made her cautious. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly, meeting his eyes again, searching for something that made sense, something she could categorize, but his answer was not what she expected. "Because I remember what it feels like when a small problem is actually a big one," he said, his gaze steady but distant for a brief second, as if he was looking at something far beyond the store walls. And Hannah frowned slightly, not fully understanding, and he continued, "When I was a kid, my mother once stood exactly where you were, choosing between food and something else we needed. And I remember thinking that if I ever had the chance, I would make sure no one had to make that choice in front of me again." His words were simple, but they landed with weight, and Hannah felt something shift inside her. Not just relief, but recognition. As if for the first time, someone truly understood the invisible pressure she carried every single day. And yet, even with that understanding, she still felt the need to protect herself. "I cannot pay you back," she said quickly, almost defensively, but he shook his head slightly. "I did not ask you to," he replied, then reached in his coat and pulled out a small, clean business card, holding it between his fingers for a second before offering it to her. "But if you ever want something more than just getting by, call me." Hannah looked at the card but did not take it immediately, her mind racing with doubt, caution, and a small, dangerous spark of hope she was not sure she could trust. "I do not even know your name," she said, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his expression, subtle but genuine. "Alexander Reed," he said, and even though the name did not immediately register in her exhausted mind, there was something about the way he said it that suggested it carried weight far beyond this moment. And as Hannah finally reached out and took the card, her fingers brushing against his for just a fraction of a second, she felt the strange certainty that this was not just help. This was a turning point she had not been expecting. And as she stepped away from the counter with the bag in her hand and her babies finally settling, she could not shake the feeling that her life had just quietly shifted in a direction she could not yet see. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh as Hannah stepped out of the store, the cool evening air brushing against her face like a quiet reset. Yet her heart was still racing, not from panic anymore, but from something unfamiliar, something she had not felt in a long time. And as she adjusted the diaper bag on her shoulder and carefully checked on Lily and Noah, who had finally settled into a calm silence, she glanced down at the small business card still in her hand, turning it over as if it might reveal something more the second time she looked at it. "Alexander Reed," she whispered under her breath, the name lingering in her mind without context, without meaning, yet somehow impossible to ignore, and she slipped it into the side pocket of her bag, telling herself it was just a gesture, just something polite to keep. Nothing more, because allowing herself to believe it meant something bigger felt dangerous. Like stepping toward a door she was not sure she was ready to open. And as she reached her car, an older sedan that carried more miles than she liked to think about, she carefully loaded the groceries into the back seat, double-checking the formula, as if it might disappear if she looked away. And for the first time that day, she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when a crisis has passed, but the weight of everything else still remains, because one act of kindness did not erase overdue rent. It did not refill her nearly empty gas tank, and it certainly did not guarantee what tomorrow would look like. And as she sat behind the wheel, she rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel for a brief moment, closing her eyes, allowing herself exactly 3 seconds of stillness before reality rushed back in. And when she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifted almost instinctively to the bag beside her, to the pocket where the card rested, and she hesitated, her hand hovering for a second before pulling it out again, studying it more carefully this time, the clean design, the embossed lettering, the quiet confidence it seemed to carry. And something about it did not match the idea of a random stranger. It felt intentional, deliberate, like an invitation rather than a coincidence. And yet her mind immediately pushed back. reminding her of every time things had not worked out, every time help came with conditions, every time hope led to disappointment. And she shook her head slightly, placing the card back in her bag. Not today, she murmured to herself, starting the engine as it turned over with a slight hesitation before finally catching, and the drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets thoughts grow louder. And by the time she pulled into the parking lot of her small apartment complex, the sky had already dimmed into a deep shade of blue, the streetlights flickering on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. And as she carried the babies upstairs along with the groceries, step by careful step, she felt the familiar exhaustion settle back into her body. But beneath it, there was something new, something she could not quite define, not relief, not exactly hope, but something close enough to both that it made her pause at her front door, her keys in hand, and for a brief moment, she looked down at her bag again, at the place where the card rested, and wondered, not for the first time, what would actually happen if she decided to call. The apartment door clicked shut behind Hannah with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than usual in the quiet hallway. And for a moment she stood there without moving, her back resting lightly against the door, as if she needed that extra second to gather herself before stepping back into reality. Because inside that small space was everything she was trying to hold together. And as she gently set the car seat down and carefully lifted Noah into her arms, while balancing Lily against her shoulder, she moved through the dimly lit living room with practiced precision, her body operating on habit even as her mind remained elsewhere, still circling around a single moment, a single voice, a single name that refused to fade. And once both babies were settled and fed, their small, steady breathing filling the room with a fragile sense of peace, Hannah finally allowed herself to sit down on the worn couch, her muscles aching in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, and she stared at nothing for a few seconds before reaching for her bag again, slower this time, more deliberate, pulling out the card and holding it between her fingers as if it carried weight far beyond its size. And she read the name again, Alexander Reed, this time letting it sink in deeper, letting herself acknowledge that this was not just a stranger. This was someone who had stepped into her worst moment and changed it without hesitation, without expectation, and that alone made it harder to dismiss. But at the same time, it made it harder to trust, because things that seemed too good usually came with something hidden, something she could not afford to risk, especially not with two lives depending on her. And she leaned back slightly, exhaling as her eyes drifted toward the ceiling, her thoughts pulling her in two directions at once. One side reminding her of every time she had struggled alone, every bill she had barely managed to pay, every night she had gone without just to make sure Lily and Noah had enough. And the other side, quieter but persistent, asking a simple question she could not ignore. What if this was different? What if this was not about taking something from her, but about giving her a way forward? And she closed her eyes briefly, as if that might silence the question, but it only made it clearer. And when she opened them again, she looked at the card one more time, her thumb tracing the edge absent-mindedly, before finally reaching for her phone, her heart picking up slightly as she unlocked the screen, hesitating just long enough to feel the weight of the decision before slowly typing in the number printed on the card, each digit feeling more significant than it should. And when the number was complete, her finger hovered over the call button, suspended in that small but powerful moment where everything could still remain the same if she chose not to act. And she took a quiet breath, steadying herself, reminding herself that doing nothing had not gotten her anywhere different. And with that thought anchoring her, she pressed call, bringing the phone to her ear as it began to ring. Once, twice, each tone stretching the silence in the room, until finally, on the third ring, a calm, familiar voice answered on the other. And Alexander Reed speaking. And Hannah's grip tightened slightly around the phone as she realized there was no turning back now, her voice soft but clear as she spoke. "This is Hannah, from the store." There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough for Hannah to feel her pulse in her fingertips, before Alexander's voice returned, calm and steady. "I was wondering if you would call." And something about the way he said it made her sit up a little straighter on the couch, her eyes instinctively moving toward Lily and Noah, as if to ground herself in something familiar. "I almost did not," she admitted. Her honesty surprising even herself, and there was a quiet exhale on the other end. Not disappointment, but understanding. "That makes sense," he replied. "Trust is expensive when life has been difficult." And the accuracy of that statement caught her off guard, making it harder to keep her guard fully up, and she hesitated before asking the question that had been building since she dialed. "What did you mean earlier about a chance?" There was no rush in his response, no pressure, just clarity. "I run a company, and we have a program for people who are willing to work hard but have been given very few opportunities. It starts small, flexible hours, training included, and it pays more than most entry-level jobs." Hannah's grip tightened slightly around the phone, her mind immediately calculating what that could mean. Rent paid on time, groceries without anxiety, maybe even savings, but just as quickly, doubt pushed in sharp. "And protective? Why me?" she asked, her voice more guarded now. And there was a slight pause before Alexander answered. "Because you did not ask for help when you needed it most, and that tells me more about your character than anything on a resume." And for a moment, Hannah did not know what to say, because no one had ever framed her struggle as strength before, and that unfamiliar perspective unsettled her more than she expected. But before she could respond, a sudden knock on the door broke the moment, loud and unexpected, making her flinch slightly as both babies stirred, and her heart skipped as she glanced toward the door, her mind instantly jumping to the overdue rent. And she lowered her voice. "Hold on," she whispered into the phone as she carefully stood, moving toward the door with cautious steps. And when she opened it just a few inches, her fear was confirmed. The property manager stood there holding a clipboard, his expression firm but not unkind. "Hannah, I need to talk to you about the rent," he said, and the words landed heavy, tightening the pressure in her chest all over again. "I know," she replied quietly, stepping slightly into the hallway, so her voice would not carry inside. "I just need a little more time." And he sighed, glancing down at the paper before looking back at her. "I have already given you extra days. I cannot extend it much longer." And for a second, everything felt like it was collapsing back into place, like the moment at the store had only been a brief pause in an ongoing storm, and Hannah swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I understand," she said, even though the words felt heavier than she could carry. And as she closed the door again, her hand lingered on the handle for a second, her composure cracking just enough to let reality rush back in. And when she returned to the couch, lifting the phone back to her ear, Alexander's voice was still there, steady and present. "What just happened?" he asked. And Hannah hesitated, then answered honestly, "I might lose my apartment." And there was no judgment in the silence that followed, only a shift, subtle but unmistakable. "Then you do not have time to wait," he said, his tone still calm, but now more decisive. "Come to my office. Tomorrow morning at 9, I will text you the address." And Hannah blinked, caught between the sudden urgency and the opportunity, her mind racing with everything that could go wrong, every reason to hesitate, but also every reason not to. And as she looked at her babies again, their small, peaceful faces completely unaware of how close everything was to unraveling, she realized this was no longer just a choice about herself. And with a quiet breath, she said, "Okay, I will be there," not knowing that this decision would pull her into a world far more complicated than she expected. The next morning came faster than Hannah expected, as if the night had skipped over the part where she could fully process what she had agreed to, and by the time the first light slipped through the thin curtains of her apartment, she was already awake, staring at the ceiling with a quiet tension in her chest that refused to settle. Because today was not just another day of getting by. Today carried the weight of something uncertain, something that could either lift her out of the constant pressure she had been living under or pull her into something she did not fully understand. And as she carefully got out of bed without waking Lily and Noah, she moved through her routine with more focus than usual, preparing bottles, packing the diaper bag, double-checking everything twice, as if precision could somehow control the outcome of the day. And when she finally dressed, she paused for a moment, looking down at her reflection in the small mirror near the door, smoothing out her simple blouse and jeans, aware that she did not look like someone walking into a corporate office, but also aware that she had nothing else to wear, and that thought lingered just long enough to stir a familiar doubt before she pushed it aside, because turning back was no longer an option, and the drive across town felt longer than it actually was, every red light stretching the anticipation, every turn bringing her closer to a place that felt completely outside her world. And when the building finally came into view, tall and glass-covered, reflecting the morning sky like something distant and untouchable, Hannah slowed the car almost instinctively, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel as she took it in, realizing just how different this world was from hers. And for a second, she considered driving past it, telling herself she could call later, reschedule, find a safer moment. But the memory of the knock on her door the night before anchored her in place, reminding her exactly what was at stake, and with a quiet breath, she pulled into the parking lot, carefully finding a spot and turning off the engine, sitting there for a moment as silence filled the car, broken only by the soft sounds of her babies shifting in the back seat. And she turned to look at them, her expression softening as she reached back to gently adjust Noah's blanket, then Lily's, grounding herself in their presence. "This is for you," she whispered, more to herself than to them, before opening the door and stepping out. The cool morning air sharper than she expected, and as she made her way toward the entrance, each step felt heavier than the last. Not because she could not walk forward, but because she was leaving behind a familiar struggle for something unknown. And when the glass doors slid open automatically, revealing a bright, polished lobby with clean lines and quiet movement, Hannah felt the shift immediately. The kind of environment where everything seemed controlled, intentional, and far removed from the chaos she was used to, and she hesitated just inside the entrance, aware of how out of place she might look. But before doubt could take over completely, a receptionist looked up from the front desk, offering a polite, professional smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" And Hannah swallowed softly, steadying her voice as she stepped forward. "I have a meeting with Alexander Reed." And the moment the name left her lips, something changed in the receptionist's expression, subtle but noticeable, a flicker of recognition that made Hannah realize once again that she had stepped into something much bigger than she originally thought. And as the receptionist nodded and reached for the phone, Hannah felt her heart begin to race again. Not from fear this time, but from the growing awareness that this meeting might not just change her situation, it might redefine it entirely. The receptionist's fingers moved quickly across the desk phone as she gave Hannah a polite nod, her voice lowering slightly as she spoke into the receiver, and within seconds she looked back up with a more attentive expression. "He is expecting you," she said, standing and gesturing toward a set of private elevators just beyond the lobby. "Someone will take you up." And that single sentence sent a quiet wave of realization through Hannah, because it confirmed something she had only begun to suspect. This was not a casual meeting. This was something arranged with intention. And before she could fully process that thought, a man in a tailored suit approached with a calm, professional demeanor. "Ms. Miller," he said, as if he'd been waiting for her specifically. And Hannah nodded, slightly surprised to hear her name spoken so confidently in a place where she felt so out of place. And she followed him toward the elevator, her steps measured, but her mind racing, taking in every detail. The polished floors, the quiet hum of conversations, the effortless way people moved through the space as if they belonged there. And when the elevator doors closed behind them, the sudden quiet felt different, more enclosed, more real. And as it began to rise smoothly, Hannah glanced at the reflective walls, catching a glimpse of herself holding the diaper bag, her expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. And for a moment, she wondered if she looked like someone who deserved to be here. But the thought barely had time to settle before the elevator slowed and opened to a floor that felt even more distant from her world, quieter, more refined, with large windows stretching across the far wall, letting in bright morning light that filled the space with a calm, almost controlled energy. And the man guided her down a short hallway before stopping at a set of double doors, knocking once before opening them gently. "She is here," he said, stepping aside to let her enter in the room. She walked into a spacious but not overwhelming, designed with a kind of understated confidence that did not need to impress because it already did. And standing near the window, looking out over the city, was Alexander Reed. And when he turned, his expression remained exactly as she remembered, calm, observant, and steady, but now there was context around him, an environment that made it clear he was not just someone who could help, he was someone who had built something significant. And Hannah felt that reality settle in as she took a few steps forward. "You made it," he said, his tone simple but acknowledging, and she nodded, adjusting her hold on the bag slightly. "I said I would," she replied, her voice steady even though her thoughts were anything but, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence. Not uncomfortable, but filled with the weight of what this meeting represented. And then Alexander gestured toward a chair near his desk. "Please sit." And as Hannah lowered herself into the seat, she became aware of just how different this moment was from where she had been less than 24 hours ago, standing in a checkout line hoping her card would go through, and now sitting in an office high above the city, being offered something she did not fully understand yet. And Alexander moved to his desk, picking up a thin folder before placing it in front of her, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "Before we talk about the opportunity, I want to understand your situation," he said, and Hannah hesitated for just a second, because explaining her life out loud had never been easy, but something about the way he asked made it feel less like an evaluation and more like a conversation. And she took a quiet breath before beginning, not realizing that what she was about to share would shape not only what he offered her next, but how far he was willing to go to change her future. Hannah's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the folder as she began to speak, her voice quiet at first, but steady, as if each word had been held back for too long and was finally finding its way out. "I work 2 part-time jobs," she said, her eyes briefly lowering before meeting his again. "One in the morning at a diner, and one at night, doing cleaning," and Alexander did not interrupt, his attention fully on her, not just listening, but absorbing, and that made it easier for her to continue. "I had to leave my full-time job when I found out I was having twins, and after they were born, there was no one to help. So I took whatever I could find." She paused for a moment, not because she did not know what to say, but because saying it out loud made it feel more real than she expected. "Most days, I'm just trying to make sure they have what they need," she added softly, glancing toward the diaper bag beside her, as if it represented everything she was working for. And Alexander nodded slightly, not with pity, but with recognition, and after a brief pause, he opened the folder and turned it toward her, revealing a clean, structured document. "What I'm offering is not a favor," he said, his tone clear and grounded. "It is a position in our operations support program. It starts at $24 an hour, full training included, flexible scheduling for parents, and after 90 days, there's an opportunity to move into a full-time salaried role with benefits." Hannah blinked. The numbers alone enough to shift her entire understanding of what was possible, because it was more than she had ever earned in one place, more stability than she had ever been offered. And for a second, the room felt quieter, as if everything else had faded just enough for that opportunity to stand alone. And yet, even with that, her hesitation did not disappear. It simply changed shape. "Why does this feel too easy?" she asked honestly, her voice not accusing but cautious. And Alexander leaned back slightly, considering her question before answering. "Because you are used to everything being difficult," he said, and that answer landed deeper than she expected, but he continued before she could retreat into doubt again. "This is not easy, Hannah. It is a commitment. You will be expected to show up, to learn, to grow, and to prove that you can handle more responsibility. The difference is you will not be doing it alone." And something about that last sentence shifted the weight in the room, because being alone had been her default for so long that the idea of support felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, and she looked down at the document again, scanning the details, her mind moving quickly between possibility and fear, until one question surfaced above the rest. "What happens if I fail?" she asked quietly, and Alexander's response came without hesitation. "Then you try again," he said simply, "but you will not be where you started, because you will have learned something, and that matters." And Hannah sat there for a moment, letting that sink in, realizing that this was not just about a job. It was about a shift in how her future could look and slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his again, the doubt still present, but no longer in control. "What I need to do?" she asked, and for the first time, there was a subtle change in Alexander's expression. Not surprise, but approval, as if he had been waiting for that exact question. And he slid a pen across the desk toward her. "You start by saying yes," he replied. And as Hannah looked down at the pen, then back at the paper, she felt the weight of the decision settle into something solid, something real. And with a steady breath, she reached forward, not fully aware that this moment, this simple action, was the beginning of a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. Hannah stared at the paper for a long second after her name was written across the bottom. The ink still fresh, as if signing it had not just confirmed a job, but quietly rewritten the direction of her life. And when she finally looked up, there was something different in her expression. Not certainty, not complete confidence, but a steady shift away from fear towards something stronger. Something that had been there all along, but had never been given the space to grow, and Alexander noticed it. Without needing to say anything, simply nodding once as he closed the folder and set it aside. "You start Monday," he said, his tone calm but definitive, and Hannah felt those words settle in, real and immediate, and for a brief second, the weight of everything she had been carrying seemed to lift just enough for her to breathe differently, not easier, but with purpose, and she nodded in return. "I will be here," she said, her voice more certain than it had been at any point since she walked into the building. And as she stood, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, she hesitated for just a moment before adding, "Thank you, not just for this, but for yesterday," and Alexander gave a slight shake of his head, not dismissing her gratitude, but redirecting it. "You showed up," he replied. "That matters more than anything I did," and that perspective stayed with her as she walked out of the office, through the quiet hallway, and back toward the elevator, each step feeling different from when she had first arrived, not because the building had changed, but because she had, even if only slightly. And as the elevator doors closed and began to descend, she caught her reflection again. The same clothes, the same tired eyes, but something else beneath it now, something steadier. And when she stepped back into the lobby, the world did not feel as distant as it had before. It felt like something she could step into piece by piece, and outside the air felt warmer, or maybe it was just that she noticed it differently. And as she reached her car and carefully settled Lily and Noah back into place, she paused before getting in, looking at them with a quiet intensity, as if trying to capture the moment, because this was the point where things began to shift, not all at once, not in a way that erased the challenges waiting for her, but in a way that gave her something she had not had before, a path. And as she started the engine, her phone buzzed softly on the passenger seat, a message appearing on the screen from an unknown number. And when she opened it, her breath caught slightly as she read the short, simple text, "Rent is covered for this month. Focus on your first day. AR." And for a moment, she just stared at it, the reality of it settling in slowly, not as relief alone, but as something deeper, something that made her eyes sting as she quickly blinked it back, because this was not just help, this was someone choosing to invest in her future before she had even proven herself. And as she placed the phone down, her hand steadier now on the steering wheel, she looked ahead, not where she had been, but at where she was going, and for the first time in a long time, the road in front of her did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something she could actually follow. In this emotional journey filled with touching stories, a struggling single mother faces one of the hardest moments of her life when she cannot afford basic formula for her newborn twins, standing helplessly at a checkout line as pressure builds and hope seems out of reach. Everything changes when a powerful billionaire CEO unexpectedly steps in, not with pity, but with purpose, creating a moment that sparks a chain of life-altering events. This narrative captures the raw reality of survival, dignity, and resilience, showing how one decision can shift an entire future, making it one of those unforgettable, touching stories that highlight the contrast between hardship and opportunity as the single mother navigates fear, doubt, and responsibility. She's given not just financial relief, but a chance to rebuild her life through hard work and determination. Guided by someone who understands struggle more than he reveals, the story unfolds with emotional depth and realistic tension, blending vulnerability with strength in a way that defines the best touching stories, where every small step forward carries meaning. From a declined car to a life-changing opportunity, this experience reflects the quiet battles many face and the rare moments when help arrives without conditions, making it a powerful example of touching stories that resonate across audiences. Ultimately, it is a story about courage, trust, and the willingness to take a chance when everything is at stake, leaving viewers inspired by how a single encounter between a single mother and a billionaire CEO can transform not only circumstances, but also belief in what is possible through truly touching stories. Character 1. A 28-year-old white American single mother, tired but strong expression, casual worn jeans and simple blouse, holding infant twins, front-facing view, natural lighting, realistic skin texture, emotional eyes, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon. Character 2. A 39-year-old white American billionaire CEO, sharp jawline, composed confident expression, wearing a tailored dark suit and crisp white shirt. Front-facing view, natural lighting, realistic skin texture, refined appearance, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon.